Hello, everybody. Welcome on the Lights on Data show. Today, we're going to talk about how to balance conversations between introverts, extroverts, and how we can do that through a conversational balance table. And to do so, we have its inventor, David Rose. David, welcome on the show.
Hey, thanks, George. Thanks for inviting me to come on.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. Now, you're an entrepreneur, MIT lecturer, author, and expert on digital product innovation and ambient computing. You're an expert on how businesses can thrive in digital disruption and how to best leverage next generation technologies today. You're the inventor of some of the most revolutionary tech for some of the largest companies in the world, including this conversational balance table that you've developed for Salesforce. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I founded a company a number of years ago called Ambient Devices. And the insight around ambient was there's a lot of information that is hiding and presented to us at the wrong resolution. So if you make for example, an app that shows you what the traffic is on your homeward commute, seems like a good idea, but the 5 or 10 seconds that it takes to access that information will be something that people aren't willing to do. And it's the same problem with a lot of home health quantified self data, that a lot of people, there are sensors that we wear and then we just don't consume the data. So the insight around ambient devices was, how could you really create glanceable level information? The first product that we created was called the Ambient Orb, and it showed you, it's a frosted glass ball, this is one, and it just glows different colors to show you things that you care about. So how many steps have you walked? Or how much are you paying for energy right now? Or when is the next bus coming? Any kind of one-dimensionalizable data that you can get from the internet, you can map to color and then make it super glanceable. It was in the invention of this that we realized people love the kind of distillation of information, and they also pay attention to it without a lot of cognitive load. So it's not like reading this kind of dense, tufty chart, but it's just something you can do in your peripheral vision, less than a quarter of a second. You don't find it taxing to other things. It's like having a window. Like, I can tell you it's sunny out today without having to say, wait a second, George, let me check and see what the weather is. Like, you just have this kind of ambient sense of what's happening. So when we created the orb, we noticed that when people track the stock market, they're more likely to trade. When people track their steps, they're more likely to walk more. When people track their blood sugar levels, they're likely to take better care of their diabetes. And so that got us thinking, trading more stocks is not great for your portfolio strategy. You should mostly ignore your investments and just not react emotionally in the moment when the market tanks on one particular day. And so we were thinking, what could we do that would really help people? And one of those things was, could we create furniture that kind of has this ambient display that helps people in a team see who's contributing and who hasn't contributed to a particular conversation? So that was really the inspiration for the balance table, was working with an architecture firm called Gensler, who were building the new Salesforce offices. And they came to me at the Media Lab and said, how could we improve how people work together through ambient information consumption?
This is the balance table. It looks like an ordinary table, but there's something else important going on. A conversation where everyone participates is a balanced conversation. Really, the moment that you want people to realize that there isn't balance in a meeting is right during the meeting, and then people will adjust. There are introverts and extroverts, and you really want the introverts to share their ideas, because they often have the best ideas, but they're often just suppressed in an organization by the extroverts. So this is a real-time feedback device that helps everybody in the meeting see who's participating and who's not participating in the meeting. And in the case where you've been quiet, if you do have an idea, you're more likely to sort of give voice to that, and actually even more likely to interrupt someone else who's been dominating the conversation, because now you have the evidence that you can, and it would be appropriate for you to contribute. Now you're seeing people that are passing the conversation back and forth in a much more interactive, much more collaborative way that's going to generate a lot more good ideas.
Nice. Maybe it was about 10 years ago or so, I read this book by Susan Cain called Quiet, the power of introverts in a world that
Exactly.
can't stop
That's
talking.
exactly right.
And apparently, at least 1/3 of the people that we know are introverts. And there are a lot of really well-known introverts out there that have a lot to say, but maybe they're more on the listening side. But it's people like Rosa Parks, Dr. Seuss, Steve Wozniak as well, that are introverts, and we owe a lot to them as they're great contributors to our society. So sometimes I think there's a lot more people like them that they feel they don't have a space on how they can contribute during that conversation if it's in a group full of extroverts.
So I read that book too, and that was part of the inspiration for the table, was that introverts have just as many ideas, but they don't have the airtime to be able to share those ideas in most organizations. And I don't think the extroverts realize what's happening. They really don't process that they are dominating the conversation in the same way that as they usually are. So the motivation for this table was, how could you show someone graphically what's happening in the meeting in a way that motivates behavior change in the moment, right? So if you think about how big is the feedback loop for information to behavior change? I don't know. Do you have a dog, George?
I have a cat, but
Okay.
acts
Well,
like a
usually,
dog sometimes.
if your dog doesn't do something that you approve of, if you can't discipline them and show them where they peed on something in the moment, it's useless. You can't go to your dog and be like, okay, I want to have a conversation about behaviors you've been doing over the last couple of days. The feedback loop has to be really tight for asking people to change their behavior. The tighter you can make the feedback loop, the better. So we made a table that has 6 sides, 6 facets to the table. And each of those has a little sound sensor, a little microphone that's just determining, is someone talking from your side of the table or not? So we don't know exactly what you're saying. It's kind of privacy by design. But as sound comes from that part of the table, it gradually lights up a constellation of LEDs that are underneath the veneer of the table. So it makes this kind of beautiful starlight pattern. But after 10 or 15 minutes, you can glance down at the table and you can see who's got more dappled light in front of them. And then almost subconsciously, we found people would just make their sentences a little bit shorter if there was a lot of light in front of them, or make a gesture to another person and say, I don't know, what about you, George?
That's interesting. So
yeah.
people become just more self-aware, and it's a self-regulating environment where they notice, maybe it's been speaking a little bit a lot. Off to you, Bob.
Yeah, but we're trying to do it in a way that's subtle. It's not, we want to create kind of a data mirror for people to create a feedback loop. So it doesn't shame anyone, but people do change, and it doesn't take like reading a report at the end of the week, but it's just something that kind of displays data that's ambient, that is informational, that is ignorable. If you've got like if the table's covered with designs for a new building or covered with food or whatever, okay, it doesn't work as well in certain situations, and you can totally ignore it. You can't turn the table on or off. You can't get like metrics uploaded to the cloud of whether Salesforce is doing better at conversational balance over time and who's responsible for that. Like, all of that is not possible. It's just this kind of a little bit of responsiveness in our environment that people will attune to and hopefully make a change over time. That's the vision, and that's what we built. It was sitting at the Media Lab for about a year before going to Salesforce, and I believe this is the future of furniture in a way. When we think about like how information is gathered and displayed, like most of us are obsessed with the phone as being like the one way to gather data and the one way to review data. But
Right.
the vision of ambient devices is like, how could we sprinkle it onto a pill cap that just subtly pulses or makes subtle sounds to get your attention in the morning? Not to be obnoxious like beeps and buzzes, but just more like a good butler who's like, who barely, almost sub or semi-consciously gets your attention in order to make you aware that it's time for the end of the meeting, or there's a car waiting downstairs or something. You don't want those things to be too urgent, otherwise you'll turn them off. Like the ICU in the hospital has that kind of too many alarm problem.
I'm curious in order of the in terms of the subtleness of those LED configuration, is it similar to the orb that you described at the beginning of the show that has different colors for whatever notification or alert that you wanted to have it configured to? Do the LED lights turn red when somebody going over a certain limit, or it's a constant
Yeah,
color
yeah.
throughout?
It's one of the frameworks in my book. My first book is called Enchanted Objects, and it's all about when things become more sentient and can talk to each other. And one of the frameworks in that book is I think I call it something like a path to subtlety. And oh yeah, here it is. Designing for subtlety. So it has maybe we can put it in the show notes, but it has this gradual curve that goes from pre-conscious to ambient awareness to apparent to intrusive. And I feel like that's really a great design space for people that are thinking with data, of like things that are pre-conscious are things like a subtle shift of color or a scent or a temperature of something or a subliminal sound effect, usually low frequency noise, will prompt you without you saying, I don't know exactly what it was, but I had this sense that something was changed. And then things that are ambient are things like light or haptic feedback, just glowingness or a change in pattern. And then more apparent are things like subtle sounds or pulsing light or motion in your periphery. And then intrusive or like ringtones. So I feel like the design challenge here is to do things that are in that kind of subliminal, ambient, subtle space. And for that reason, George, we made the constellation of lights are just all a kind of yellowy white. So we thought if we get into the color dimension, people might feel shamed. If you use green, does that mean go? Or red might mean something bad is happening. So we really wanted to keep it just subtle and all white.
Makes sense. Do you think that with over time, if we were to use tables like this one long enough, we would become like Pavlov's dog, that every time we would see an ambient yellowish light, we're like, oh, okay, I should stop talking?
maybe. I do. It's an interesting question about whether after you get used to a stimulus like this, do you train yourself so you don't need the stimulus anymore, or do you become entrained to need the stimulus, not do it? Like now that there's a chime when you don't put on your seatbelt in your car, are you more likely to put on your seatbelt before the chime, or do you always wait for the chime to put on the seatbelt? It's this interesting question about how do habits form, and do you still need the stimulus even after the entrained? I don't have the perfect answer, but I'm curious about that, especially when it comes to situations where we're leaning more on autonomous systems in order to take over certain jobs for us. And if you have a level 3 car, which is level 3 of the 5 levels of autonomy, is the one where in certain situations you can drive hands-free, or it will drive for you and you can follow. But then when it's ready to get off the highway or whatever situation, it will wake you up and say, George, in 10 seconds, it's all you. And I think that's a particular design challenge too, of like, how do you give someone a really rapid situational awareness of what's going on around them, so that even though you haven't been tracking, you're kind of coming out of cryogenesis and it's okay, you have to start living in 10 seconds. How do you give somebody that kind of ambient awareness of everything around them? What are the hazards? What to watch out for? What's the context? I'm actually working on a autonomous boating system now that uses computer vision to kind of sense everything around you from the top of the boat. So this is a 360 camera with computer vision. But then the ambient data challenge is, given all of the situation where now you're coming into a marina or you're coming into a channel or another situation, how do you give somebody that kind of 3D reconstruction of World of Warcraft or Clash of Clan kind of view from back and above, of a 3D reconstruction of, here's you, here's your boat, here's the situation, there's a jet ski coming in from over here, there's some rocks over here that a lot of people hit, so don't. So it's just rapid situational awareness. That's the challenge. Doesn't that seem like a kind of ambient, it's an ambient data display problem as well.
It sounds fascinating. It sounds like the future is here already, thanks to you. Dan Everett here, the techno-optimist, is mentioning that once the neuropathways form, He doesn't think that you need that stimulus afterwards.
Good. What's your, I don't know, does Dan have a like kind of case of
Data to back it up?
when that's been true for him, of the
I'm not sure. I'm
no longer need the prompt?
Dan, feel free to chime in.
I am optimistic. I am optimistic that he is right, because I think there are lots. I'm trying to think of other situations. I hope for my children that when I discipline them or when I reward them for certain things, that they don't require the reward every time or cleaning up the kitchen, but instead they're like, oh, this is what I do at the end of the meal. I clean up. Yeah.
David, can you tell us a little bit about the guts and the challenges of the software that you've really chosen to use for the table?
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago now. Let me try to remember. We hooked up all the LEDs. I actually worked with an awesome design firm called Telart that's down in Providence, Rhode Island, and they're also in Amsterdam. And they did a lot of the coding for the table. So it was quite a construction, because it was hundreds of LEDs that we arranged in kind of a random pattern, and they were all hot glued in, not a very scalable model. And then they were hooked into a dedicated, I think we used a Mac Mini for the guts, and Python for the programming to get the microphone inputs. Yeah, here's the this is down at Telart doing the assembly, and then the software that kind of gradually finds out the pattern to fade them up. You can see there were microphones at each facet of this kind of 6-sided table. I think if I were doing the project today, I would probably use data projection. Yeah, there's the Mac Mini. I would probably use data projection to achieve the same thing. So there's a new data projector that Samsung just came out with called the Freestyle. And it's like the size of an old coffee can, and it's probably 2K res data projector. It has actually an Edison mount. So you could screw it into where the light bulb goes over a table. So super easy to install. It just shines data like a LCD, any kind of data projector. Like you could watch a movie on the table as well, but this would be a nice subtle way of tailoring the lights to give the people who are there a kind of sense of the passage of time or feedback dynamics in a group. I feel like there's so much promise there. There are a couple of companies that are doing the same kind of or similar kind of feedback systems for Zoom. There's one company in Boston that I just heard of, I'll think of the name in a second, that give you a little feedback at the top of your screen that shows you, are you looking at camera? Are you using your hands? It aggregates those into are you engaged metric. And
interesting. I don't know if you saw one of the latest demos from NVIDIA that they have the AI software being able to overlay your eyeballs really on your face to make it seem that you are always looking at the camera, even though you're not.
Yeah, perfect. Like deception technology. Like you might, I'm not in favor of the driving an avatar with your face so that you can deceive people into thinking that you are engaged when you're actually not engaged, or you're
defeats the purpose.
Yeah, that seems like that. I guess you could argue it's just like makeup. It's just like wearing fancy clothes. Like you're just taking it up a level, but it does seem to betray some natural signals that that we rely on in order to have better communication. If I teach at MIT, if all of my class decided to turn on their face filters and so that they looked engaged and they looked like they were understanding everything, like it would make me a much worse teacher because I wouldn't have that feedback.
I wanted to mention that Dan came back to talk about the neuropathways, that you will need a stimulus once those are formed. And he was giving the example of learning to drive a car. That really takes a lot of cognitive power to learn to drive, but once the pathways form, it really just becomes a habit.
Yeah, it's true. Although cars aren't very good at adapting themselves based on your expertise, right? My daughter just learned to drive a couple of years ago, and you want the turn signals to be extra loud and maybe the speed at which you're going around a turn, how many G's you're pulling around a turn to offer some feedback sound, just so you get a sense of like the risk of slippage. And maybe after you learn to drive, you would turn that feedback off.
That's why you have your dad sitting on the passenger seat
Going,
for that
whoa!
instant feedback. Yeah.
That's the data feedback loop, right? Yeah, that's true. I have a question for you about kind of information feedback, just about driving, since I've been thinking about boating and boating feedback. When it comes to a backup camera, every car has one these days, and no boat has one these days. There aren't really systems built into boats yet that give you feedback for how close you are to something, or when you're backing up, how close you are to docks. Do you think that the augmented reality overlay of just like a perspectivized ruler that just shows you, hey, you're this close, is sufficient? Or do you think it should pulse as you get close to something? Or do you think you really need haptics on the steering wheel, or acoustic, like in order to guide you into place? Or do you feel like the acoustic is really like heavy-handed?
So I think definitely it needs a little bit more than just visual itself. I think we need other sensory signals there. I know, for example, when I'm driving the car and I'm backing up, I don't trust that camera as much as I trust my eyes. So every time I also hear the noise or see a flashing, it gives me a little bit more trust for some reason. I don't know if that's just me or it would apply to other people too.
No, I think the trustability aspect is really key. Like being able to see what it sees. There's this notion of feed-forward devices, feed-forward interfaces. Have you heard of that term, feed-forward?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, so like an example is if the Tesla is doing an automatic lane change, it will show you your car and then show you a highlighted box next to the car of where the car will be in the future if you don't do anything, or if you sometimes you have to hit the stick, but you could set it so it's going to do it on its own. But that's a really interesting kind of, it's an autonomous system that is saying, hey, George, I'm going to do this thing, this next action, unless you tell me not to. And I think it's the interface design challenge of our time, I think, is like how do we know the mind of the AI, and how does it understand our mind so that it comes to trust us, not to fall asleep at the wheel and to take over if we are asleep or agitated or whatever, and then vice versa. Like, how do we trust that it sees the obstacles so that we don't take over control when we don't need to take over control?
This is so fascinating, and I hope that we can have you back on the show to talk more about one of your inventions or one of your books, as I think there's so much more to address. Do you want to do a plug for your latest book?
Sure. I was just thinking about the agentive systems. That's oftentimes what the term for, like, how do you design for control that goes between an agent and a human, and an agent and a human. And there's a framework in the new book. The new book is called Supersight. It's all about computer vision and augmented reality. And there's a framework there that, here it is, on page 192, which is called Control Models for Agentive Systems.
This framework illustrates a continuum of control modes for AI-based systems, using self-driving as a case study. On the far right, the AI takes active control, like on Google's self-driving car, where there's not even a steering wheel. On the far left is the passive mode, where an assistant may only swoop in at the last moment so a human doesn't make a dangerous error, like hitting a pedestrian. The design challenge of our time is to create a shared system of control where AI and humans collaborate for the best outcomes. What would it take for both systems to share control? It requires bidirectional understanding and trust between both human and AI systems, a shared mental model to know the abilities of each and predict the performance and dependability of each other. For driving and healthcare, the stakes are so high, it's critical to get this collaboration right.
They're like different approaches. The Google car had the AI in control so much so that you just didn't have a steering wheel, right? You're not going to take over. There's no steering wheel. And then the opposite side is more like what Toyota has been doing, which is more like a guardian angel, which is the AI. There's not really an opportunity to have the AI take over with the Toyota systems, because it will only take over control like right before you hit the wall or right before you make a big mistake, but you can't really pass control back and forth. And then Tesla's somewhere in the middle, which is these kind of collaborative handoffs. But I really feel like this is one of the biggest design challenges of the decade, is how do you visualize with data the who sees what, who understands what, who with what confidence level in order to do these control handoffs.
I look forward to find out what brilliant minds like yourself really come up with what the best practice would be in the future. So thank you.
Pick this up if you're interested. That's super psyched.
Super psyched.
Yeah.
All right. We'll add it to the notes too. Okay. Thank you so much, David Rose.
As a closing thing, I guess I would encourage people to go to SuperSight, SIGHT world. That's where you can see examples of a lot of AR projects for like boating or for sustainability or for workouts that do body tracking experiments that I've been up to. And people can download a free chapter of the book and get design principles that are in Miro, and there's a bunch of stuff there.
Thank you, David. All right. Happy Friday,
Thanks for
everybody.
Yeah, happy Friday. You too.